David here with Matt. Hope you all are having a really nice holiday weekend. Matt, I'm hoping, is in Aruba drinking something out of a coconut, though I have a feeling he might be just deep in the playoffs in 2K.
Exactly. I'm going to be working on my team domination sort of league.
Well, while we're doing that, we were hoping that y'all might revisit some of these really awesome conversations that we've had over the years. Some of y'all, especially newer listeners, may not have checked out our radical reading series, where Matt and I have looked at some of the great thinkers on the left. And this is just a taste of a couple of them for you. But, you know, these were recorded a couple years back. They still hold up. Matt and I go through the text. We take a really close look at it. We're hoping to do a lot more in 2025. So if you like these, please consider subscribing at patreon.com/leftreckoning and send us a message and tell us any kind of text you'd like to see us do in the future. I will just say, word of warning, it's very helpful if these are kind of shorter texts. We're not going to be able to do a book, but something that you can, read in 30 minutes or so. As you'll see, some of these go on pretty long, and we were too ambitious. We learned our lesson.
When we've done books, we've gone about, I guess we're not going to be able to finish this in 2 episodes, are we?
Yeah, but they're a lot of fun. We really do like doing them, and I hope you all enjoy them. So without further ado, enjoy the Radical Reading Series.
All right, folks, it is the return once again of our Marx reading series. Hello, David. How are you?
I'm not bad, brother. How are you?
I'm excited to be returning to this. I like doing these sorts of things. I'm a book club sort of nerd, and it's good to always return to texts. This is one of my favorite Marx writings, one of the earliest that ever made an impression on me. This was assigned to me in my 19th century philosophy class in undergrad at Minnesota State University at Moorhead. And I remember thinking about everybody have time to be a shepherd. I can't remember the exact line. We'll play it later, but a herdsman, a critic. And that really spoke to me, not least because I had no idea what my fucking major was going to be at that point. And not having to make a decision was nice. But I'm excited to be talking about this with you, David.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think we'll have a little bit of an introduction, but this is an important text for a few reasons. I think both historically, as people who want to study Marx, is recognize. I mean, this is the beginning of his materialist turn. Or actually, it's not the beginning, because there's hints of it in some of the other sections that we've actually done as criticism of Hegel, another of the young Hegelians, and the Feuerbach. But this is really if it's not the early murmurings, I mean, this is the outspoken break with a certain kind of popular philosophy at the time, and the beginning of Marxism, like Marx's theory of history and of politics and philosophy. And yeah, it's very worthwhile. We're going to be moving primarily from a long section, but a section of the German ideology, part 1, section A, which, if y'all want to read this, we'll put a link in the bottom. I highly suggest just come through. It's about 17 pages printed out, so something you can do in an hour or two if you want to. I think it's you'll definitely understand it better if you read it and listen to this. Maybe listen to this first and then read it after. But it's a fundamental text, and it's fun. I was saying to Matt before, it's fun coming back to some of these from being a baby Marxist and being I got to read, all these things, and sort of, grappling with it and wrestling with it, and coming back many years later once you've incorporated a lot of this thought into your own thinking, and maybe having a deeper understanding of what he's getting at in a lot of these places.
Yeah, so Marx is in his late 20s, I believe. He's living in Brussels. I got this section from this Jonathan Sperber. I think it's Sperber, the Only from Audible stickers covering the author's name on this. But Sperber, Karl Marx, The 19th Century Life. We'll just play this for a little bit of the intro and kind of for this book, which the full title is called A German Ideology, Critique of Modern German Philosophy According to its Representatives Feuerbach, B. Bauer, and Stirner, and the German Socialism According to its Various Prophets. And so we're just going to call it the German Ideology. Here is this intro from Sperber. Slow that down first.
When the bourgeoisie ended the rule of the feudal nobility. Marx's second major theoretical effort during his time in Brussels is commonly known as the German ideology, although, as the researchers on the new Mega have painstakingly demonstrated, such a work does not, and never did, exist. The German ideology as book title appears only once in a letter to the editor Marx wrote in 1847, announcing that one volume of a two-volume work would not be appearing in print. In the surviving manuscripts, the line, ideology in general and the German ideology in particular, designates a chapter. This dissection of a title may seem picky and pedantic, but it is important, because the manuscripts of what is known as the German ideology were not one intellectually consistent enterprise. They evolved in erratic fashion, acquiring and shedding co-authors and differing in argument and proposed method of publication between their origin in late 1845 to early 1846 and their final abandonment by mid-1847. The work began as a collaboration between Marx, Engels, and Hess. It was to contain critiques of the young Hegelian radicals along the lines of the Holy Family that were to appear as a series of articles to be published in the proposed revival of the Franco-German yearbooks. Parts of this original emphasis continued throughout the project. In particular, criticism of one of the young Hegelians reached enormous length. As the manuscript expanded, Marx began to think of it as a book, and increasingly, a two-volume work. The first volume would be a biting critique of the young Hegelians. The second, an equally savage attack on the true socialists, a group of German intellectuals professing socialist ideas. Moses Hess was, in many ways, the intellectual leader of the true socialists, so that a project beginning as a collaboration among Marx, Engels, and Hess ended up as an assault on Hess's own ideas. Since Hess had introduced Marx to socialism and strongly influenced his initial concepts of it, the denunciation of the true socialists was a form of veiled self-criticism.
You kind of see some of the idiosyncrasies of working with Karl Marx.
Yeah.
But it makes me think of like a podcast, like let's come together as all political podcasts, and then you just start like having drama because there's just ideological or personal ideological arguments that get in the way. But yeah, this is why we're sticking to like the first bit, like 1A. There is it goes further, and maybe we return and pick at some of the later parts of it's a much longer work, but it does get very specific into these different figures, like with some very comical sort of titles. Like I'll just read like kind of Saint Max, like making fun of Saint Bruno, Bruno Bauer, the young Hegelian. So like making fun of them as like quasi-religious figures,
which they would hate.
Exactly, like new messiahs, because he's saying like, yeah, because they were critics of religion, but yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. And I have one other thing too. Like, so this is just from the volume Collected Works volume 5 intro. But this is a section that, and let's see what you think of the David. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels not only developed in all of its aspects the thesis of the decisive role of material production in the life of society, which they had already formulated in their previous works, they also revealed for the first time the dialectics of the development of the productive forces and the relations of production. This most important discovery was formulated here as a dialectics of the productive forces and the form of intercourse. It illuminated the whole conceptual system of historical materialism and made it possible to expound the substance of the materialist way of understanding history as an integral scientific conception.
I mean, I think that's a pretty solid like summing up of it. I mean, this is where you get a lot of the basic building blocks of Marxism, particularly like in relation to society and history, which is why the Marxist analysis is something that is still usable today, because it's very applicable not only towards looking at history like sitting from Marx in 1845, but at looking at history for us today, 2022, looking at the movements of societies over the past 150 plus years as well. Like this is a very fundamental text, and like there's like a couple things I think are worth like remember when we're going into it. There's like two things. There's the criticism of like idealism as like as a philosophy and as a tool for understanding society, something Marx very much disagrees with, while also looking at the kind of general historical progressions of society. So there's two aspects: the criticism of idealism in favor of materialism, and then also like a working out of like what a materialist view of history would look like.
Mm-hmm. So the first, and you might want to listen to our episode on the thesis of Feuerbach, because I feel like the early part of this is sort of a summation of that. But here's, I think, the preface. This is just 3 minutes here, but a good sort of overview of what we talked about there too.
A Critique of the German Ideology by Karl Marx. Preface. Hitherto, men have constantly made up for themselves false conceptions about themselves, about what they are and what they ought to be. They have arranged their relationships according to their ideas of God, of normal man, etc. The phantoms of their brains have got out of their hands. They, the creators, have bowed down before their creations. Let us liberate them from the...
That line, especially when I was an atheist as an undergrad, really got to me. And that is really a rehash of Feuerbach, what we're talking about there. But the creations of their minds, they bowed down before them. Like, damn, man.
The chimeras, the ideas, dogmas, imaginary beings under the yoke of which they are pining away. Let us revolt against the rule of thoughts. Let us teach men, says one, to exchange these imaginations for thoughts which correspond to the essence of man. Says the second, to take up a critical attitude to them. Says the third, to knock them out of their heads, and existing reality will collapse. These innocent and childlike fancies are the kernel of the modern young Hegelian philosophy, which not only is received by the German public with horror and awe, but is announced by our philosophic heroes with the solemn consciousness of its cataclysmic dangerousness and criminal ruthlessness. The first volume of the present publication has the aim of uncloaking these sheep, who take themselves and are taken for wolves, of showing how their bleating merely imitates in a philosophic form the conceptions of the German middle class, how the boasting of these philosophic commentators only mirrors the wretchedness of the real conditions in Germany. It is its aim to debunk and discredit the philosophic struggle with the shadows of reality, which appeals to the dreamy and muddled German nation. Once upon a time, a valiant fellow had the idea that men were drowned in water only because they were possessed with the idea of gravity. If they were to knock this notion out of their heads, say by stating it to be a superstition, a religious concept, they would be sublimely proof against any danger from water. His whole life long he fought against the illusion of gravity, of whose harmful results all statistics brought him new and manifold evidence. This valiant fellow was the type of the new revolutionary philosophers in Germany.
So there you go, Mark Spicy in the preface.
Yeah, well, it'll be spicy throughout the text, like, and like, I mean, we're really gonna hunker down and get into his criticism here, but like, I mean, that comical example is making it very clear. It's like this idea that it is, ideas that create reality versus reality creating ideas is at the fundamental, is like what Marx is fundamentally trying to break with the whole, or at least of like dominant German philosophy. And I don't know if we're ready to jump in to the opening bit, because like so the first section of the text, this is part one, part A of it, and that's what we're gonna be focusing on. He opens up with what he calls the illusions of the German ideology, and we're not going to jump into this entire section except to note that he's writing at this time of like significant upheaval in German society, rapid change in history, not just in Germany but all across Europe. And he says here, criticizing all of these folks, basically lining out their idea that heroes of the mind overthrew each other with unheard of rapidity. And in the 3 years, 1842 to 1845, more of the past was swept away in Germany than any other time in 3 centuries, right? And it's right that like a lot of stuff has been changed in society. But here's Marx kind of dig at the people who are basically saying this is an ideas revolution. All of this is supposed to have taken place in the realm of pure thought, right? So he's really hitting at these people who are refusing to sort of look at the fundamental changes in production, in like early capitalism in Germany, and in like politics at large there, with just being different thesis, like different ideas winning out over other ideas, something that Marx is very, very much against.
Yeah, yeah. Later in the same section is the young Hegelian ideologists, in spite of their allegedly world-shattering statements, are the staunchest conservatives. The most recent of them have found the correct expression for their activity when they declare they are only fighting against phrases. They forget, however, that these phrases they themselves are only opposing other phrases, and that they are in no way combating the real existing world when they are merely combating phrases of this world.
Yeah. Again, like I think a pretty solid dig at like a very popular movement in Germany at the time. Where it's like, again, like if you are really interested in this stuff, I do suggest just going back and listening to our episode on criticisms of Hegel's philosophy of right, where we're really going to get into some of the philosophical differences. We really spent a lot of time getting into like outlining what the young Hegelians and what Hegel's philosophy of history and society were there. I think because this is such a rich text in some of the things that I think are like novel at the time, some of the arguments that he's making that are new. We're going to focus more on that. But like, if you're really interested in like hearing that those two ideas being hashed out, I suggest going there. But yeah, like, so basically we're set up now in this kind of fight between, philosophical fight between Marx and, these young Hegelians who are, saying, we're going to change people's ideas. We're going to fight against phrases that we think, hide the truth, instead of like looking toward society at large, right? And like he says right before that section that Matt read, the young Hegelians demand to change consciousness amounts to a demand to interpret reality in another way, to recognize it by means of another interpretation. And Marx just finds that to be a flat out wrong way to think about the movements in history and society. But we can jump into the materialist method, I think, because this is where it starts to get juicy. So this first section after the kind of introduction, Marx lays out the first premise of the materialist method, and what this really is about is like the existence of living human individuals. And he opens up by saying the premises from
I
which
can
we
play this too, by the way.
Okay, yeah, if you have,
that's
sure.
easier for you. Got it queued up right here.
First premises of materialist method. The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises, from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. These premises can thus be verified in a purely empirical way. The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Of course, we cannot here go either into the actual physical nature of man or into the natural conditions in which man finds himself, geological, hydrographical, climatic, and so on. The writing of history must always set out from these natural bases, and their modification in the course of history through the action of men. Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life.
That section there is something that it has stuck with me, but I think I like attributed it to Locke or something like that.
Mhm.
But it's obviously very Marxian. Like man becomes man when they. Let me just read it again. Uh, uh, shoot, where did I scroll? Oh, here it is. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. Like I've always thought that is a very like sort of deep philosophical statement.
Absolutely. And like this is also what sets up history at large, right? This is like what creates the opportunity for us to be living in something that we call history versus just like, I don't know, natural life. I mean, this is the separation of human beings from animals in the way that like, 'cause once you start being able to produce the products, the things that you need to actually survive, it creates a whole host of other needs, as we'll get into later. And like this really is, and he'll say it more explicitly later, like some of the first acts of history, once we're starting to be able to produce our own needs, right? Produce commodities to satisfy our needs, because once you start doing that, then you start getting different kinds of needs start to arise. That further start to separate us from just like the level of just pure subsistence into something of like a higher, experience of being. And then from that, like it starts to create different tensions and contradictions within human society based on where you are in production, based on what things that are needing to be produced, based on where you get sort of placed in the division of labor. I mean, this is like a very radical moment in the beginnings of, human society at large. And again, it's coming from, like these things are through like the act of producing. We're not only just meeting our needs, we're also producing society. And this is like where Marx, I think, really um, is different from even some of the other kind of like natural state philosophers too, right?
Mm.
Like that are very dominant in the Enlightenment, because he takes that understanding and really modernizes it. I mean, you get a bit of that with like Rousseau, but Rousseau is such a puzzle, because I think you could take a lot of different positions on what it is that Rousseau actually wants. Like Rousseau has that famous line, like, the worst crime in human history was the creation of private property. Something I can't remember exactly the text, but it's like, the first crime against like our natural state was when somebody put up a fence, essentially, and then that sort of set us up into this inequality. And like, I think that Marx's understanding is actually much deeper, because those processes actually really opened up the possibility for something much grander than any kind of like return to like a primitive state of producing and engaging with one another.
Yeah. Should we keep rolling this a little bit?
Yeah, let's do it.
Distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. The way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends first of all on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce.
It's just very interesting to think about. I mean, your mind can go all sorts of directions. You think of the Kowalski from Nebraska calling in from his tractor, right? Or we were just talking with those Utah boys about like what the job careers are, and you basically like, because it's all Mormon sort of culture, there's like you go into sales for multi-level marketing, right? And it's like, or you can think of it in like the natural state of like, okay, I'm able to like I have this plot of land and we're able to farm this and look at this surplus to take us through the winter and that sort of thing. Like it is sort of determinative of so much, and everybody has an understanding of this on a pretty basic level, right? Like, what's one of the first things you talk about on a date? Like, what's your relationship to how you're sustaining yourself is foundational, really.
I totally, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and like he, you know, makes the argument that as population increases, like through this production, um, it also changes the way that we relate with one another. And I think that one thing that's really important to remember, Harvey. Oh, I guess you haven't. The interview that will be out with Harvey on Tuesday, we talked about this briefly, but it's important to remember, for example, you know, that class is a relation. It's a relation between people, and I think a lot of folks miss that aspect of Marxist thinking, that like these things aren't sort of, these things affect you individually, but they are constructed collectively, and that's why these things have to be social struggle. That's why, like, you know, a lot of times, like, you get these kind of fantasies from people on the left that it's like, you know, we're going to go back to the land and, like, you know, leave this or that, and I as an individual basically overcome the contradictions of society. And you know, Marx and Marxism, like, very much like disagrees with that conception, because it is your relation to others, your relation to society, your relation to production that ends up defining you. So if you want to sort of move the ball forward, if you want to you know, affect those relations, these things have to be kind of collective, society-wide struggle versus you going on like a personal journey of like self-expression or self-realization, which again I think like really defines it compared to, like, you know, I talk about this a lot in the American context. It absolutely was happening in Marxist time. You always have these like socialists who are like, what we're going to do is we're going to create like a little town and we're going to have like a socialist you know, society, and it's never taken off or worked
Right.
compared to like revolutionary models that have sort of seized society and reshaped it, because at the end of the day, like, at your highest stage when you're relating with society, right, like at a certain point your town or your community has to relate with the rest of the world, which is, you know, going to define like your way of being. And two, just like on a practical political level, it's just like you're never going to be able to develop production to the level that it exists like in society at large to be able to compete and create like a alternative model to this kind of thing, which is something that I think is worthwhile to remember, because especially in moments of like political despair, I think a lot of people are like, well, all right, we're not going to be able to win politically. We're not going to be able to win at large. So like, I'm just going to retreat into the small community to be able to influence the world. And it's a bit wrong-headed.
Yeah, I mean, basically things like, I don't think we get to this. This is in section B, but like, he's talking about like the steam engine is required for certain types of liberation and that sort of stuff. Then he gets into a section in 1A here, back to where we're reading from, about the division of labor and forms of property and different stages. You have the tribal, the ancient, and feudal. He goes into, and also discussion of town and country.
Yes,
which I always thought was very interesting. You know, basically Rome was the sort of city model, and then the feudal era was more country, because you have landed estates and that sort of thing. Anything you thought was interesting from this section, David?
I mean, I'm going to go over a couple of things. I don't think we need to read long sections or anything like that, but you know, he makes this argument which we've hinted at before, and this is like the, you know, one of the engines of the argument, is that each new productive force, insofar as it is not merely a quantitative extension of productive forces already known, for instance, the bringing into cultivation of fresh land, causes a further development of the division of labor. And why is this? It's because, as we were saying earlier, it creates new needs. Like, you know, if you're going from a society that is doing like hunter-gathering stuff, and then you start doing, you know, early forms of agriculture, well, then you also have needs that are separate from that. You need tools, you need, you know, cultivation technologies, and you need people to be producing those. So now, like, your needs are growing as your ability to basically meet your basic needs, you know, are getting stronger, we're also getting more and more needs in society for, you know, other kinds of things. And like, I think this is something that people understand sort of intuitively, but it's a very important to understand that the relationship between, you know, growing productive forces also creating more and more needs. And like, you could think about that in a modern context. Um, Electricity is something that is definitely a basic human need at this point because of the way that we live, because of the way that we interact with each other. So as we become more advanced productively, we also have different kinds of needs that are growing, as those new productive forces come into being, and they create these kind of tensions in society. As Matt was saying, I think this town versus country is actually a very, very good example, because I think it's something that people grasp intuitively, in the sense that, like, yes, depending on where you live, that affects who you are and what you do. And there's a big difference between people who are living in more urban or town environments versus people who are living, you know, in the country, and subsisting primarily from agricultural labor. And he goes, um, the methods employed in agriculture, industry, and commerce, um, patriarchalism, slavery, estates, classes, these same conditions are to be seen given a more developed intercourse in the relations of different nations to one another, and recognizing that, you know, as these forms are growing and becoming more complicated, now we have a new form of interaction with people, not just the family, not just like the tribe or the, you know, the town, but, you know, these kind of newer forms of social organization, being the nation. And he says, I'll just read this longer block quote out. The various stages of development in the division of labor are just so many different forms of ownership. In essence, the existing stage in the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to material instrument and production of labor. And unless you had anything to add to that, I don't think we need to read through the entirety of these different early forms of ownership and production, but I have some quick notes on ancient and communal state ownership. You know, the ancient, or the first form of you know, is tribal, which is effectively like a slow but expansion of like the family, right? Like the family being like the first block, and then the family sort of growing outside of that into more tribal forms of production and organization. And he says, you know, some things here about, you know, this making possible, for example, the relationship of slavery, which is very prominent in early you know, human society. He says the slavery latent in the family only develops gradually with the increase of population, the growth of wants, and with the extension of external relations, both of war and of barter. Um, and you know, the division of labor there is still like very early in its development. And the only natural division of labor is existing in the family. But he argues that the system of slavery is actually something that sort of is an outgrowth of the kind of top-down order of the family, in the sense of like the patriarchal system of
I
the
mean,
father,
how
you know.
you look at American slavery and like the way, like, I mean, obviously you have the major plantations where you have, you know, giant, like hundreds of slaves, but like the more like sort of middle class ownership of slave, that was like to maintain a level of domesticity that could only be achieved if your wife is going to be sort of like unless she's going to be on her hands and knees scrubbing the floors every day, through slavery. So I mean that connection, and that's at that time, right? This is the 1840s.
Yeah, and like that's like an advanced system of this early system too.
Right,
but like,
right, of course.
you know, and but not no, I mean, like, and not to skip too far ahead. But if you look at the production of ideology, like if you read, as Matt spent a lot of time like reading like the thought process of slaveholders, there is all of this kind of language of like how to be a good slave owner. You have to take care of them like a father takes care of their children, right? Like you produce an ideology that attaches itself to the system of production that you're living under, right? And this like similar kind of things, if you look at like, you know, philosophers from antiquity, like there is all of this stuff about like what is proper when it comes to dealing with the slave in the Bible. You know, like these things develop, these kind of social ideas develop out of them, And the point here is like to recognize the kernel. It's not necessarily like some guy as much was like created like the best argument for like thinking about these things. It was that because society was being governed and organized in a certain sense, the ideology to like not just justify it, but quote unquote, don't understand me wrong here, like perfect it, develops alongside of it. And he talks then about like, so out of the tribal form of ownership, you have what he calls the ancient communal and state ownership. And, he designate this as like, when you start to get tribal governments, tribal like societies sort of merging together, two basic ways that he says that this happens, either through confederation, like out of free, out of need and consent, tribes sort of joining together, or through war, right? Or through just conquering your neighbors and putting them under your control. But what is the mode of production here? He argues that it's a form of communal ownership. Private property is subordinate to communal ownership in the early form of ancient and communal state ownership. And how so? He argues that slavery, which is like the main mode of production in that period of time, is something that only has power coming out of community, in the sense that like it is not solely through your individual authority that you're able to maintain this, but through the community, through the kind of understandings and the way that people thought about other people at the time, through utilizing society to sort of punish a slave worker who steps outside of that what it is that they're supposed to do. It is something that is relying on the community. So therefore, even though like maybe a family might own, slaves, it is communal ownership because it's necessitated on the existence of that kind of communal structure.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is where you get like slave catching acts and stuff like that, right? Like if an individual, fancy boy like Jefferson, like he'd be turned on very quickly if he couldn't rely on the rest of like the sort of gentry militia to help him like turn back a slave revolt or something.
And I think you can see a lot of the kernels in there, but I think it's important to understand like the historical development that this early form of like ancient and communal like slavery and also like production is different from like the American context, in the sense that like it wasn't so attached to, for example, like a global market where like the price of cotton is like affecting the treatment of slaves in like those ancient systems. But absolutely, like I think that the point is correct, though, that like the communal like aspect of this is a necessary precondition for slavery, both in the ancient version and like the later American plantation system. Then he goes on to Rome, and I don't know, are you a big Rome history guy, Matt?
I'm not. I've dabbled, but never done. I don't have a super good lay of the land, to be honest.
It's one of those things where I feel like there's a time in American history that has sort of been lost, where like that was very, very well known.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
classics education, and is a little bit less so. But he makes the argument about in Rome that like out of a concentration of property that happens very rapidly towards the end of the Republic and the rise of the imperial system in Rome, you start to see a huge concentration of private property. You start to see that system start to become very dominant in a way that it hadn't in society, at least in Europe, previous to that. And he makes an interesting argument here about the plebeians and the proletariat, and basically argues that in Rome during that period of time, you start to see the plebeian small peasantry turn into a proletariat. But because the proletariat was so defined actually as a class in between property citizens and slaves, it doesn't create its own kind of independent development from those two classes, because it is like very much defined at like the fundamental tension at that period of time was between slaves and citizens. And even though there is this other class that is growing, it is really much like determined by the fact that it's sort of a middle in between position between being enslaved and being like a proper citizen of Rome. And as much as I think we could dive into more of that, I think that that's good enough for now, because Rome gets really fascinating with like the concept of the people in Rome being something that's like, you have citizens, and that's like confers like rights to vote, but the people had a lot of power in Rome, which is always an interesting thing, to realize that even in a kind of like slave and unequal society like that, there was this concept of like the people, which is that you always had to appeal to, even if their like forms of political power weren't as developed, but you see them like start to develop pretty significantly, ironically, in like the late Republic, early like imperial period, but that's a whole other monster I think to get into, versus these developments.
I just like the discussion of brief about how serfs and peasants escaping to the city, but they're emancipating themselves not as a class but as individuals. You kind of see why he'll later focus on industrial workers, because you have both the concentration of workers, like not individually able to emancipate themselves on capital, but the serfs escaping is. So then he goes to now the essence of the materialist conception of history, social being, and social consciousness. This, as a communication studies major, was interesting to me to talk about language as like, like you don't have language to like, talk to yourself.
Wait, before we jump in that next section, just like one more thing on feudalism, because you mentioned it, but it's just like for people who haven't read it yet. He argues that antiquity, like the great Greek civilizations, the great Roman civilization, comes out of the town, right? Like the town being the center of life. But in the Middle Ages, society emanates from the country. And he argues that, again, like this is the materialist understanding of history versus it being about like, oh, ideas are changing. It was like the conditions of life were changing in Europe. So you see a massive decline in population. You see people spreading out across Europe into the country. So you don't have that same kind of like organization around the city. So, feudalism as like a productive ideology has to come out of that system, because the actual way of life of people had changed so much that people had returned much more into like rural spread out communities versus sort of being concentrated in like a major metropolis or town. And that's why you start to see, this, what he calls them the robbing nobles, coming to power. And then to protect themselves, what do they have to do? They have to create feudal kingdoms. This is from the text. The grouping of larger territories into feudal kingdoms was a necessity for the landed nobility as for the towns. The organization of the ruling class, the nobility had therefore everywhere a monarch at its head. And he's using this to like make like an actual like universalist argument about like the development of history globally, right? You see that as you start moving into these early feudal systems of production, the monarchy grows in like tremendous fashion into becoming like at least in parts of the world, like the dominant form of both like legal and also material production, that it's all sort of incorporated into this. And again, it's like this is a material understanding of politics versus like, everybody coming together and being like, you know what, we need to have like blood gods to rule over society, actually being a kind of necessary function of society to maintain the power and productive system of feudalism.
Right.
But so I didn't mean to cut you out. The language bit is really important, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's section 4, the essence of the materialist conception of history. Let's see, what's a good... the production of ideas and conceptions of consciousness is at first directly interwoven with the material activity, the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. Conceiving, thinking, the mental intercourse of men appear at this stage as direct influx of the material behavior. Men are the producers of their conceptual ideas. I mean, we're kind of getting back to a little bit of the Feuerbach stuff here a little bit, aren't we?
Absolutely. But he's making the argument about where these things sort of develop out, because like language becomes like a big point of contention in philosophy, like early days there, and then it starts to become really like 20th century philosophy. If you ever jump into it, it's gonna be a lot about language. Like that's just like what becomes dominant. But he's making an argument about like, okay, so language is something that people are like, this is, ideologies produced here, like a lot of things are done through language, but where does, how does language develop? it comes out of a direct need for production, for human society, for us to be able to communicate um, with one another. And um, so like understanding where that starts to develop from. I mean, I have this longer section that I think is an important read here. This famous his famous line. I just want to make sure I'm not skipping over anything before we get to it. But he makes the argument: ideas, conceptions, and of consciousness is directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. Conceiving, thinking, the mental intercourse of men appear at this stage as the direct efflux of their material behavior. What you were just saying. The same thing applies to mental production as expressed in the language of politics, laws, morality, religion, metaphysics of a people. Right? Men, the producers of their conceptions, ideas, real active men, as they are conditioned by a definite development of their productive forces and of the intercourse corresponding to these up to its furthest form. So like this is talking about how all of these ideas, right, are relations, are things that are produced by active people living in society and fitting in ideologically or culturally or in the form of law, like literally, maintaining those kind of productive relations. And this is where his big dig. This is like, if you want to sum up this piece in a short section, this is like Marx's real break with idealism and into materialism. Consciousness can never be anything else than the conscious existence and the existence of men in their actual life process. If in all ideology men and their circumstances appear upside down, as in the camera obscura, this phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects on the retina does from their physical life process. And if you're not familiar with what he means there by the camera obscura, it's the image is flipped in the camera obscura, right? It's upside down. So he's talking about that's the relationship between ideas and man, right? And it's like in material reality. Going further, in direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. So it's this recognition that like the ideas of heaven, the ideas that govern our society, are not things that come down and sit and impose themselves on society, versus actually something that's emanating from production, from the real existing life of people into our conceptions of heaven, of law, of morality. Going back to the text, that is to say, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real active men, and on the basis of the real life process, we demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. The phantoms formed in the human brain are also necessarily sublimates of their material life process, which is empirically verifiable and bound to material premises. Morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness thus no longer retain the semblance of independence. They have no history, no development, but men developing their material production and their material intercourse alter along with their real existence, their thinking and the products of their thinking. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. In the first method of approach, the starting point is consciousness taken as the living individual. In the second method, which conforms to real life, it is the real living individuals themselves, and consciousness is considered solely as their consciousness. And like, we should take some time to talk about this a little bit. I mean, I have two quick examples. Like Sam Harris, friend of the show, just like endless reactionary. I love what Noam Chomsky says about him. He's a religious fanatic who worships the state. Has this line about the Quran versus the Bible, or Buddhist texts. And he says, if you created an island with like 3 different societies and you just plop down upon them the Bible, the Quran, or like the teachings of Buddhism, you would have like 3 very different societies if you came back 300 years. That is just such a bonkers and anti-scientific way of looking at society. It's like the actual embodiment of like idealism, right? Where it's like the texts themselves are what are creating society versus society creating the text. So one, it's absurd unless Sam Harris actually believes in the gospel. right? That like God, came down to earth to share these teachings. It, he's creating like a holy relationship between these ideas, like a metaphysical relationship between these ideas in society versus society actually producing these ideas. It's also absurd if you look at the history of Christianity being very, very different things for very, very different periods of time. You see that development in all religions, right? Like what, excuse me, it's why you have like things like liberation theology, which look at Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple. Look at lines like, it's easier to thread a camel through the eye of the needle than it is to get into heaven, than for a rich man to get into heaven. As not being sort of the guiding focus, for example, of the American evangelical movement today. So like that is like an idealist understanding of history that is you see in Harris. Another example is like these things can be very foreign. I guess this is part of like my gospel is like I really love the Northman movie. I think it did not get the respect that it needed. But one of the points about it that I think the reason it didn't take on popular, it didn't get so, I mean, whatever, without focusing on its box office sales.
Not relitigating the Northman.
No, like, there's a point here because the Northman was a great film in my opinion, because if you haven't seen it, it's it's an epic tale set in the Viking Age, and Eggers made a real point of doing like Viking morality with the main characters, wherein they were worried about like their honor, getting into Valhalla, and made decisions based on that kind of morality. And it makes sense. If you were a Viking and you are from well, I know Vikings a verb, whatever. Like if you are like a raider, you come from a place that is very destitute. So therefore your society needs you to go out and raid and pillage and take material from other parts of the world and return those back to your homeland. Is it surprising that there is an ideology that basically is trying to turn all young people into like fighting warriors? That like there is like a belief that if you die in battle, like that is the greatest honor, right? It is a one-to-one. Like the needs of society were to have people go out and raid and pillage and put themselves at risk in order to make that society function. So of course that's the morality that develops. And the reason I bring up the Northman instead of just focusing on the Viking thing is like a lot of times when we do historical movies in the US, like I think Gladiator, which is a great film, but Gladiator really embodies this, where instead of it having like a Roman morality and understanding of virtue and like living in society, there's a very kind of like American, like I want to return to my family and like take care of like those that I love, versus like in the Northman where he rejects that. He doesn't go back and like spend time with his family at the end of the day and say like, all right, I'm leaving war behind. He says, I'm gonna fucking die. I don't want to spoil the movie, but like I'm going to just like die on a cold rock versus like returning to like a life of comfort, because that's my understanding of like my being. I bring that up just like sometimes when you look at those older societies, like their morality can be extremely foreign to you because we don't live in the same conditions, and therefore our morality and understanding of like what is good, what is right, what we should be doing is something that is actually produced versus something that's sort of coming from heaven to humanity. It's something that's coming from the conditions of our society into our own heads.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's like Civil War notes where guys are like, I'm gonna stay here for another tour because this is, and even like the Confederates are like, it's, yeah. And some guys did go back to be with their families, but you see like that sort of honor. Interesting.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say, talking about the materialist analysis, its premises are men, not in any fantastic isolation or rigidity, but in their actual empirically perceptible process of development under definite conditions. As soon as the active life process is described, history ceases to be a collection of dead facts, as it is with the empiricists, or an imagined activity of imagined subjects, as with the idealists. And, he goes on to basically note the importance of history. I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add there, but basically saying, history is a very important thing for philosophy, and in fact, in a lot of ways, makes philosophy a second tier way of thing to engage in versus like
Yeah.
the actual material study of society.
Is this a section where he mentions, or is that later, where he mentions the cherry tree? I think it's later, but he's talking about, I think Feuerbach talking about the sensuous existence of a cherry tree, but like you need to historicize cherry trees because they weren't there, but
Yeah.
for, you know, Columbus, right? And that whole, they're for a New World transplant. So yeah, that's not something you need to tell me. As somebody who privileges history over philosophy.
And yeah, so let's get into this next section here. History, Jesus Christ. History, fundamental conditions. And rather than read through the whole section, I have some bullet points to understand it. Is like, to make history, men must be in a position to live. This is the first historical act is the first historical act is thus the productions of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. And indeed, this is a historical act, a fundamental condition of all history, which today, as thousands of years ago, must daily and hourly be fulfilled merely in order to sustain human life. I'll just go on. Even when the sensuous world is reduced to a minimum, to a stick, as with Saint Bruno Bauer, he's taking a dig at him there. It presupposes the action of producing the stick. Therefore, in any interpretation of history, one has first of all to observe this fundamental fact in all of its significance and all of its implications, and to accord it its due importance. You know, so we have been producing food and other things to survive from the get-go of human society. And he's saying this work is still ongoing. And as you know, these systems become more complicated, new needs, new contradictions, new tensions in history develop out of it. But the first fundamental condition of history is that we have to be in a position to live, right? I think, fairly basic, but a lot of people skip over that. And they make production, like a lot of philosophy treats production as a secondhand effect of society. And this really, I think, delineates like Marxists from a lot of even other popular, like left-wing philosophies, right? It's like, it's production at the end of the day, which is like where you need to be. The beginning of your analysis needs to be dealing with that. And a lot of like bourgeois philosophy like treats like production as a kind of like after effect of society instead of the fundamental relation. He also notes that like the satisfaction of needs creates new needs, as we sort of developed earlier, and that starts to create these tensions in society. One, because you have to produce more things, more specialization in work, and also the relations to where we live, how we live, start to develop coming out of that relationship as well. Another really important condition of history is the understanding that men make other men. We reproduce ourselves, right? So that, versus like a kind of individualistic or individual view of society, where like you yourself alone are like the individual, and then you're like thrown into society. Marx is making the argument that no, it's actually society that is creating individuals, both through like education and things like social reproduction, like learning the language, like being educated, all of that, but also like in the actual physical understanding of like we create other human beings. So in order for you to exist, like your family, your parents had to be able to exist, and like that production creates more people. So like there's like the really basic level of like actual reproducing of human beings, and then the kind of reproducing of beings into society. And those things actually aren't as easily separated as like some people try to treat them.
Yeah. I mean, and interspersed in all this is a lot of shots at German philosophy and basically
Yes.
being backwards. But yeah, like you get that, and you see that, if you look at like the British Empire in India, for instance, in like the 19th century, it was you were going there for opportunity. If you were a young British male to like enforce the Raj, and then by the like the 1920s and 30s, it's like delinquent, and it's less able to like excite people, and you're not reproduce, like the sons of the people who were running it are looking for other types of opportunities elsewhere and things like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like, the family is obviously a very fundamental block of human society. It's one of the earliest forms. He argues, but he also argues that the family was created to meet needs, and the family also becomes subordinate as population grows and new needs arrive. So, like this early form, like at first, the family becomes extended into like this sense of like the tribal sense in history. Um, and then as like society continues to grow and become more complex, the family also becomes subordinate to those needs. And I'll just read a little bit from this text. The production of life, both of one's own in labor and a fresh life in procreation, now appears as a double relationship. On the one hand, as a natural, on the other, as a social relationship. By social, we understand the cooperation of several individuals, no matter under what conditions, in what manner, and to what end. It follows from this that a certain mode of production or industrial stage is always combined with a certain mode of cooperation or social stage, and this mode of cooperation is itself a productive force. Further, that the multitude of productive forces accessible to men determine the nature of society, hence that the history of humanity must also be studied and treated in relation to the history of industry and exchange. But it is also clear how in Germany it is impossible to write this sort of history because the Germans lack not only the necessary power of comprehension and the material, but also the evidence of their senses. For across the Rhine, you cannot have any experience of these things since history has stopped happening. And, he's making these pushes. It's always funny to hear Marx go on about the Brits or the French, like, different national peoples having these kind of understandings, but he's making an argument like the popularity of certain philosophies in Germany are very, very limited in being able to understand this historical process because they overdetermine certain things.
Yeah. And I mean, I think about it like in modern terms, how people are like, I'm just thinking of, when I went to college, before that, the 2000s, you had like the smartest people were going into financial engineering and becoming quants and learning how to like, because that's where the money was. And then subsequently following that, there was the rise of like the coders and like all the like those sorts of people. And it just seems like whatever the money wants, that's going to create a new type of guy that is going to be a leading sort of type in society.
And you noted this earlier, like that's like a very like clear and modern understanding of like how like the changes in production affect like people's lives and what they end up doing. But he goes on to talk about language. And he says, language is as old as consciousness. Language is practical consciousness that exists only for other men, which I think is an interesting way to put it.
Right.
And for that reason alone, it really exists for me personally as well. Language, like consciousness, only arises from the necessity of intercourse with other men. Where there exists a relationship, it exists for me. The animal does not enter into relations with anything. It does not enter into any relation at all. For the animal, its relation to others does not exist as a relation. Consciousness is therefore from the beginning a social product and remains so as long as men exist at all. Consciousness is at first, of course, merely consciousness concerning the immediate sensuous environment and consciousness of the limited connection with other persons and things outside the individual who's growing self-conscious. At the same time, it is the consciousness of nature which first appears to men as completely alien, all-powerful and unassailable force with which men's relations are purely animal and by which they are overawed like beasts. It is thus a purely animal consciousness of nature, natural religion, just because nature is yet hardly modified historically. And like, he'll go on to argue, it's like the fact that we are able to start to interact with nature, right? To be able to build things that like utilize natural forces for our own benefit. I mean, think about, dikes and dams, right? Like this like fundamentally changes our relationship with nature. And zooming back just a second, like, the language, which is like the fundament, like that's how you think, right? You think in a language. That is something that too is like, even though it might feel like individual to you, that is something with like the handprints of society all over it.
Right. Because it doesn't make sense, like, to talk to yourself, right? Like, and everything, like ultimately, like, and it's pretty profound thing because of how natural language is to humankind, that it just proves like basically we're to get as reductive as possible, like hardwired to communicate with people, and like any sort of, I don't know. I think it's very interesting. Like
No,
it's a social production, and all knowledge is like a social product, basically.
should we jump into private property and communism?
Yeah, I'll play the first section. This is, I think, maybe the most famous section from the German ideology here.
Private property and communism. With the division of labour, in which all these contradictions are implicit, and which in its turn is based on the natural division of labour in the family, and the separation of society into individual families opposed to one another, is given simultaneously the distribution, and indeed the unequal distribution, both quantitative and qualitative, of labour and its products, hence property. The nucleus, the first form of which, lies in the family, where wife and children are the slaves of the husband. This latent slavery in the family, though still very crude, is the first property. But even at this early stage, it corresponds perfectly to the definition of modern economists, who call it the power of disposing of the labour power of others. Division of labour and private property are, moreover, identical expressions. In the one, the same thing is affirmed with reference to activity, as is affirmed in the other with reference to the product of the activity. Further, the division of labour implies the contradiction between the interest of the separate individual or the individual family and the communal interest of all individuals who have intercourse with one another. And indeed, this communal interest does not exist merely in the imagination as the general interest, but first of all in reality, as the mutual interdependence of the individuals among whom the labour is divided. And finally, the division of labour offers us a first example of how, as long as man remains in natural society, that is, as long as a cleavage exists between the particular and the common interest, as long, therefore, as activity is not voluntarily but naturally divided, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. For as soon as the distribution of labour comes into being, each man has a particular, exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him, and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. The fixation of social
That's about as utopian as Marx will sound, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fundamental break. Like, you know, here he's envisioning communism as a fundamental break with a way of being that has been with us since we first were able to start to organize ourselves in a system that had a division of labor, right? And you know, there's talking about alienation. You know, these are basically like as society progresses and our productive capacities grow, we in sense become like enslaved to that capacity, because your entire life becomes defined by what you do, right? You become a hunter, or you become a critic, or you become a trader, or whatever. And you know, he's actually arguing that communism is a fundamental breaking with this, and rectifying the contradiction that as we are better able to meet our material needs, we actually become even more enslaved to the production of you know, what is necessary for for our, you know, our basic needs and basic production. And communism is the way out, to actually live in a society which is able to produce not just basic subsistence, but expand upon that to create abundance. And not only is it a system of abundance, but it's actually a system of freedom, which no longer sort of condemns you to one area of specialization of work over another.
Yeah, it's, I mean, fascinating, like writing that, being a little bit close to medieval times, which is the time period where people were getting the name Wheeler or Carter or Cooper, like, which are literal occupations, right? Like, like those are, and so, like, yeah, like that's a I don't know how much more profound you could say, like your name is Wheeler
Yeah.
because your family makes wheels.
Yeah, like my last name's Silver, because
Mm,
that's what it means. It means like Silver Hills, right? And it's like, you know, you've become defined by like what it is that your society is producing. I don't know if we were necessarily silver miners or smiths or anything like that, but
right.
you know, you're becoming defined by these things. I know that's a really interesting point. Like, I mean, you know, this is less of a political, I mean, I shouldn't say it's not political, but this is less of like a roadmap to these things, but much more like a recognition of like these fundamental contradictions of human society, and sort of outlining how we can find a way out of them. And again, I think that this is like a really important definition, because you know, there is nothing like inherent in you that makes you into one of these things, right? It's
Mm,
not like you have a part of your soul. It's actually like you know, that it makes you, you know, an angler, but rather that society produce, you know, you get produced in society in a certain way that like you know, either directs you, like looking at it as, at its in its best form, maybe directs you what you're best suited for, right?
yeah.
Or just, you know, slots you into what is needed in your community, what you know, what production, what, you know, needs to be fulfilled by like your labor. Yeah, and you know, so it's an interesting thing is like, as we become more complex, as we become more capable of providing, we actually sort of enslave ourselves, you know, to that process, and this is a way out.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like I do feel like people's brains are too thinking like I'm inherently a this or that. Like, I mean, even the way people think about like math, like I inherently, and I do, like, I'm not super mathematic, but I also think like that might be somewhat self-imposed.
Hmm.
And you start to think of yourself like, oh, I couldn't do that. Well, it's like you might, if you had the opportunity and time to be able to like teach yourself, you actually might be able to do like, you know, be an audio engineer or ride a horse or whatever the hell it is.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like, this is like, you know, this is why, I mean, are we would we be skipping ahead too much if we got into the last section of history as a continuous process?
No, I'm ready for that.
Um, you know, because you hear Marx write in other places like very positively about things like the steam engine and all these new technologies, because they open up our capability. Like, this is one of, this is like, I don't want to open this up to a bunch of other contemporary fights, but there are some conceptions of like Marxism as like a moral criticism of society, right? And you see these kind of like anti-technology, anti-production things that have always been on the left, sort of like attaching themselves to Marxism in ways that I find to be very incoherent with the you know, the theory of history and of politics and of society that Marx puts out, because you see him write like very eloquently in favor of like all of these new technologies um, that have rapidly industrialized society, have rapidly changed the way that people's live. Like when Marx laments, for example, the movement of people from feudalism into capitalism, laments the wrong word, right? Because it's not like, um, oh no, like everything is ruined and we need to go back to some former version of like agrarian way of living. It's actually recognizing that there is a contradiction here, that as we become more advanced, as we become more capable of providing the material needs for people in society, we become more and more and more enslaved to production than we should, because we actually have the capability now, or we're seeing the openings for the capability of being able to not only meet everyone's needs, but to, you know, expand expand upon those incredibly. The fundamental contradiction of capitalism is that instead of it being a force that sort of is like liberated people in totality, we become more and more enslaved to this system of production. And the argument is not to eradicate industry or to eradicate technology or turn your back on those things. It's to make those things serve us, to utilize this incredible feat in like human understanding and human science, to actually be a force that is of liberation, for people, that can actually fundamentally break this old and ancient specialization division of labor, that has dominated human society for so long.
Absolutely.
And so, on that, like we've come into it. There's only a couple more things that he sort of argues, but he makes this argument that, one, as you see human society developing in one way, it does mean that there is a sense of history, right, of science to this.
Mm.
That it's not solely limited to certain parts of the world, but in fact, this world market, this global capitalism coming into more and more places, all of these societies with all of their particular cultures, with all of their particular histories, with all of their particular religions, becoming subsumed into this system, which means two things. One, that like we have the potential of actually creating a system of the whole world, versus like think about like just think about the blocks of social organization that he outlines. Family becomes tribe. Tribe becomes town. Town goes in for a brief period of time in antiquity into the city, and then there's a massive dispersion and lowering of human population that puts us all into this feudal system. And out of feudalism, we enter into into early forms of capitalism, and that form of capitalism, very much in Marx's time, and we see it now, becomes a global force. So we actually are moving from family, tribe, town, feudal system, to then become feudal kingdoms, into like the nation state. And then the hope of communism is that we can actually expand past the nation state into something that is global. He criticizes for that exact reason, this idea of like local communism, because it is the immiseration globally which creates the possibility of communism globally. And I'll just read this section here. He says, empirically, communism is only possible as the act of the dominant peoples all at once and simultaneously, which presupposes universal development of productive forces and the world's intercourse bound up with communism. Moreover, the mass of propertyless workers, the utter precarious position of labor, power on a mass scale, cut off from capital, or even a limited satisfaction, and therefore no longer merely temporarily deprived of work itself as a secure source of life, presupposes the world market through competition. The proletariat can thus only exist world historically, just as communism, its activity, can only have a world historical existence. World historical existence of individuals means existence of individuals, which is directly linked up with world history. And I mean, like, this is an important claim.
In I think it's in section 1B, but he goes into the rise of manufacture versus like craft guilds, and the importance of the weavers. And right, like think about weaving as an industry in the UK. Obviously, you're taking inputs from globally, and your product is having impact on the global market. So the entire production of clothing changes when industry comes to mass produce it like that.
I can't remember what text it is in. It might even be a letter, but Marx is asked like what the position of communists is on the question of free trade. And people get really confused by this because Marx says, well, the position of communists is that we support it. And they're like, what? What he means by that is that it's incorrect. And this is like, again, it goes into a lot of pathologies we see on the left today and historically. People don't, it's not that he doesn't think that, free trade and like the growth of like the capitalist world market is not a system of like deprivation and pain for people, but it's recognizing that this stage of development is absolutely necessary to be able to create a system of communism that is global. And the fact is that like it will happen. So by basically trying to prevent these kind of, accumulations from happening, you're putting yourself in a position where you're basically kicking things down the road even further and hampering the potential of utilizing these technologies, this connectedness into a political world's historic force, which was communist communist world revolution.
Yeah. And I would also just say, like, I feel like there's some contradiction between what Marx was thinking about with free trade and sort of modern intellectual property agreements among like multinationals and stuff like that. But
For sure. And I don't know, we'll just read this last bit, and then we can, if there's anything we feel like we missed or want to add to it. This is the last bit of the German ideology, part one. Communism for us is not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement, which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence. And like this too, like gets into some of like the fundamental arguments of Marxism is that it's like it is within this system that like the birth pangs of communism are growing out of. This is also why sometimes thinking about communism or socialism as like a set of like policies like on a docket is incorrect. I mean, Leo Panich says this very well. He's like, socialism is not a set of policies. It is a process, right? It is a process of changing our relationship with production, our relationship with things, and our relationships with society. And it's, I think, really critical if you want to, if you consider yourself a Marxist and you want to like utilize these understandings to recognize again that like this is not so much like at least in the German ideology, like a distinct set of like social policies to be enacted, as much as like the real movement of people, which is clawing their way towards that kind of relation.
yeah, and he's analyzing like a real movement, right? Like a year or so after this is not published, but like finalized or whatever, you get the 1848 revolutions, and probably the next Marx reading will be is probably 18th Brumaire. I think that's maybe chronologically. But yeah, like and it's interesting to see on both sides of 1848. You get the Marx trying to analyze in the midst of all these things happening, and then the sort of postmortem of how it didn't exactly come off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have it right here, folks. I mean, like, this is a very rich text. There's a lot in it. But you get what the materialist view of history is in opposition to the idealist view of history. You get you understand, I think, alienation better as kind of as an analysis than like, a lot of times when people talk about alienation, it's like very individualized. Like, I'm alienated, right? And certainly, like that is how it happens. It affects you as an individual, but like you recognize that this alienation, in this text at least, like that this alienation comes out of the fact that like as we are able to produce better and more, we become more and more enslaved to our needs in a kind of ironic, contradiction, which communism and the socialist movement is trying to rectify. The fact that we have the ability to produce so much, that we have technology that can better our lives, and yet we become more and more enslaved to our needs than ever before. Maybe one way to think about this is that, like, for Marx, like one thing that really affected his life was when he was finishing up school and he got a job at a newspaper. I can't remember the name of it, but he went to some kind of rural part of Germany. And as private property is starting to expand in Germany, the forests, which were always sort of considered to be communal property, become private property. And despite the fact that there's actually material wealth, like the fact that the trees are still there, the poor farmers aren't allowed to go and chop down the trees because they don't own it. And they die in the winter. Like significant amounts of people die, not because of a lack of material resources, but because of the way that under the system material resources are distributed, right? Like our productive capacity expands, and we actually have people dying of man-made crises. You look at things like the potato famine in Ireland. It wasn't because there wasn't enough food. It's because food was being shipped off to markets in England. And recognizing that as like capitalism starts to become the dominant mode of production in society, we have all this ability to produce. And yet, because of the very system and function of capitalism, we have to create immiseration, which is a world historic shift, actually, that, we move from things being sort of governed by nature and chance and things like that to actually being governed entirely by or largely by human society. And then the, inequities and problems that we see in society are of our own making. And sort of pushing, the communist, ideas pushing back on this alienation that treats these things as one natural forces or natural economic laws, and rather things that are created by human beings. And I think this is just like it's an extremely rich text. And coming back to it, it's, I think the first time I read it, I got a decent amount. But it's one of those things that, as you spend more time reading and understanding these things, you will always be rewarded, I think, with returning to this text. So if you haven't read it, it's a good time to jump in. It's very accessible, I think.
I think it's, as far as what we've read so far, I think it's maybe the most accessible. At least there's sections in it that are as clear as I think Marx has gotten.
And if you have read it before, I actually think it's a great time to jump back in, because you can do it, and maybe you'll pick up some stuff that you might have missed the first time, or understand arguments better. But yeah, that's the German ideology, y'all. That's a fascinating text.
There you go. All right, folks. Yeah, what do we got for folks on Tuesday?
Going back right into history with our friend Harvey J.K., talking about the British Marxist historians' re-release of his famous book. So I hope you all join us for that next Tuesday at 7 Central.
All right. Peace, folks.
Welcome, everybody. This is Left Reckoning. My name is David Griscom. I'm here with Matt Leck.
Hello.
And this afternoon, actually, we're going to be doing a kind of read-through and analysis of one of my favorite texts by Marx, the Critique of the Gotha Program. So thank you all so much for being patient, really listening to this text today.
Thanks, everybody.
We're going to try to do this in a way that even if you haven't read the text, you can still follow along with the main arguments. But I highly suggest taking a little bit of time, to read this in its full. It's a pretty short text in general. I mean, you can probably read it through in like 40 minutes or so. And it's just like, so no one gets discouraged. I just want, because, sometimes I talk to people and tell them, you need to read Marx, all this kind of things. And people, will respond and say, oh, it's really difficult. Yeah, it's difficult, for us too. These texts are really rich and there's a lot going on, which is why, in my experience, it's always better to, consistently like revisit these kind of critical texts, because it's difficult for me. And I've read this text multiple times. And even now I'm finding more and more things within it. So, reading and doing theory and, studying philosophy is really a process.
I second that. Rereading is really reading.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Like if a text is going to be really important to you, it's not going to be that important on the very first read. I think that's a myth that's helpful to capitalism, that makes you consume like entertainment and worry about like the very first experience you have with something. But yeah, no, you need to revisit this stuff.
Yeah, you're never going to read a text and then the heavens are going to open up.
Yeah, don't spoil the Communist Manifesto for me.
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyways, let's get to this. Let's get to this text, so people understand essentially what this text is. Marx is criticizing the Gotha program, which is a program that was set to be accepted by the merging of two major German socialist parties. And they really break from a lot of the kind of Marxist communist tradition that was, that was quite viable in Europe at that time. I'm going to butcher the Latin.
But he ends the text with a Latin phrase that says, I have spoken and saved my soul, which, Marx is not usually the one to use religious language like that. But essentially, he's doing this because he is recognizing, both him and Engels, that they are going to be thought of as responsible for this text, that people are going to, because they are so critical in the German, socialist movement, that people are going to think that they were the authors or behind it. So he's really writing this text, one, to set these, these parties straight, to set this movement straight, and also to very much, draw a line in the sand and say that this is not Marxism. This is not even socialism. In fact, he argues that it's quite reactionary. That's the basics of what we're criticizing. And we're just going to go through the sections and sort of add our analysis and sort of build on Marx's arguments here. So why not just jump right into it? The first tenet of the Gotha program is this line: labor is the source of wealth and all culture. And since useful labor is possible only in society and through society, the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. And Marx begins his takedown of this text with an immediate renunciation of that first premise by saying labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature plays a huge role as well. And he's not doing this to be really nitpicky. He's doing this because the understanding of capitalism and the labor struggle and the plight of working people that is put forward in the Gotha program is just extremely erroneous, particularly this kind of supernatural treatment of labor, which is something that Marx is very critical of in this first section. He argues that this kind of understanding of labor is bourgeois. He argues that, this is a supernatural definition of labor. And what does he mean by that? He means that it completely masks the relationship of the worker and the productive apparatus that they are living in, namely capitalism, and create some kind of mystical understanding of labor. Because what is it that labor does that creates all this wealth? Well, wealth is created because it goes through society, because it goes through capitalism, and that is because going through capitalism, you're creating a commodity, right, which has a use value, but it also has an exchange value. And that is the capitalist addition to the production process that is really critical if you are aiming to fundamentally change society. That you need to understand why society functions in the way that it does, and why does labor function the way that it does under capitalism.
Yeah, and should we just return to the? Did we go over enough the marrying of these two parties that had the forces program? So you basically had the SDP in Germany, right? Mm-hmm. The Social Democrats, and then the Lassalleans that Marx references here, which are, I guess, from the footnotes, they're a landlord-aligned, socialist, or I don't know, progressive. What I don't know how you define that, basically. But and in this very first part, right, labor is a source of all wealth, that fuzziness kind of helps that obscure those sort of landlord portions of it, right? Because Marx says nature also. And I can remember before I accept the label of Marxist myself, encountering it in this sort of reductive way, thinking this is what Marx believed, that labor is the source of all wealth. And it forced me into this sort of destiny logic lord position of being well, Marx, what about all the stuff we get from nature, right? And literally, and this is maybe 2012, 2013, thinking well, that's one thing that Marx didn't know. And to see him late in life be have to invoke Latin, and I'm trying to save my soul as people are putting these words in his mouth or so. But it's so kind of depressing. But it is interesting that in obscuring nature's role, you're also kind of obscuring the landlord who's aligned with these the people that are watering down this program.
Yeah, exactly. And, the land aspect of it is really critical. And you see that there was a political reason why those parties were trying to avoid that, because they were trying to build this, movement of, workers and landlords and massive, landholders, essentially, the remnants of, the feudal state or the feudal system as well. But yeah, so like there's that, and then there's also like this really critical definition too, that he starts to try to articulate in this first criticism of the first line of the Gotha program, is that, again, what it does is it obscures the relation of the worker to the productive system. How do we mean that? Under capitalism, what happens is you destroy the commons, right? You destroy people's ability to basically provide for themselves. You turn everything into a commodity. And if you don't own property, or if you're not a capitalist, what does that mean? You have to sell your labor, right? That's a societal force that fundamentally changes the act of just like creating something. And this is really what Marx is trying to hit at, is that not only are there political reasons why this is, devastating, and, they're making a bad analysis essentially of like the way that the capital system functions, but it also obscures the shifts happened in labor under capitalism. And the ruling class works really hard to try to obscure this fundamental relation and to try to make it as fuzzy and complicated as possible, because they don't want people to start to recognize that, the working people are the people who are critical to the productive system of capitalism, but they don't, share in its benefit fully. And should we go into the second bit?
I think we got enough out of the very first bit, but I do. One thing I do like about this is how Marx gets in the mode of like a bitchy editor. And like he spends so much time on just pulling something apart. I think that's something every one of us can sort of relate to, having to like sort of, not with, party programs as much, but like having to choke down New York Times op-eds. And just like every single line is infinitely objectionable. But yeah, let's continue.
No, I mean, it's so good. And Marx has a great line as he transitions into the second part of his critique, where he says, let us now leave this sentence as it stands, or rather limps. I mean, Marx is, being really, really snippy throughout this text. It's really fun to read, honestly. But the second part of the paragraph is this line, that useful labor is possible only in society and through society. Well, first, this sentence contradicts itself. If labor is the source of all wealth and culture, what is this new distinction about useful labor? Right now we're having a new category of labor, which again, this is not just trying to be super, technical, but it's really pointing out that the people who are putting together this, this program weren't really thinking in a kind of systemic way about what they were talking about or writing about.
Well, he comes up on it here, and you can kind of give us more of the background here, but he mentions one could just as well have said that only in society can useless and even socially harmful labor become a branch of gainful occupation, that only in a society can one live by being idle, etc., etc. In short, one could just as well have copied the whole of Rousseau. It does seem like it is sort of like an inversion of Rousseau, basically, and under the guise of we're socialists.
Exactly. Yeah. and essentially what they're arguing here is that since useful labor is possible only in society, the wealth that is generated from that, using their terms, useful labor, belongs to society to allow that system to reproduce itself. And Marx again makes this really critical point that this kind of understanding actually doesn't even add anything new to like the bourgeois understanding of production under capitalism. He makes the argument, is this not a definition, that the bourgeoisie could twist? Do they not believe that the payments to the ruling class, to the capitalist, to the taxman, and to the state, and all these other forms, all of these things that basically eat into the wealth that is created by, working people, do they not believe that these are necessary payments to continue to allow this society to function, right? And
yeah, you could defend like JFK's like ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country, using this logic,
exactly.
Right?
It's so
like there's no useful labor without us, guys. Get something going.
It's so squishy, and this is again like just to take a little step back. Why I think this text is really important is because we have to understand that in our position as socialists, what we're trying to do is fundamentally change the system as it works, and what that means is we have to have a very robust understanding of how the system works and how it affects us. And if you use these kind of sloppy definitions, even though these kind of they feel when you read them to be socialist statements, when you look under the hood, you recognize that, one, they're incredibly, fuzzy and inaccurate, and secondly, are something that if you create this as your party platform, you are giving ammunition to your opponents to basically say, like, oh, look, we understand that, we're doing the same thing, right? That we understand that, and that's why we have these kind of social functions that we do. And, Marx basically, fixes this and tries to fix it, does his best to fix it by saying, what they should have said is, under society, you can actually engage in useless or harmful labor and have that be gainful employment, right? He's just saying, like, if that's what you mean, then that's an unobjectionable statement. So yeah, let's go into this, this third bit here too, where they sort of add on to this. So they say, useful labor is possible only in society and through society. The proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. Again, so this is the same, the first, bit that Marx was criticizing is like, do not the bourgeois believe that they can, create this, that they, the payments that go to them, the wealth that goes to them are necessary to reproducing that society. So he goes through that again. And then he makes this, addition that they should have, basically corrects them again and says, what they're talking about is the difference between, what they're calling labor in itself and social labor. And what does that mean is that labor has existed since all of human history. Like, this is not something new that capitalism has created, right? We've been creating objects and doing work, obviously, since we've lived in society. What they're trying to get at, and what socialists are trying to get at, is what Marx is calling now social labor, which is the labor that creates the wealth and culture. And that's different from isolated labor, which can only create use value. And what happens to the isolated labor, or labor in general, under capital, becomes social labor. This transformation essentially is that before you create something to use it, right, you get your use value from that. And, for people who aren't familiar with that term, use value is literally just means, what you use something for. So a house has use value, right? You live in it. It also has, under capitalism, exchange value, what its worth is, how much you can sell it for. And that's where society basically enters into the labor process under capitalism, is by introducing exchange value to the production process, which fundamentally changes the character of our labor. I think that's a really critical point. And then he moves into this new, this new criticism next, where they say, in present day society, the instruments of labor are the monopoly of the capitalist class. The resulting dependence of the working class is the cause of misery and servitude in all forms. And this is what we were talking about earlier. He omits a very critical, a really critical actor in capitalism, which is landowners, which are no small part of the system, right? I mean, if you're talking about, in the kind of Marxist understanding of society, you lose the ability to survive under capitalism without working and then having to use the wage that you earn to pay to continue to live. And the fact that, working people are essentially landless and have to rent out spaces is a huge factor. And the fact that they're also, especially in Europe at this time, are just, small families that own majority parts of the country. That's a huge aspect of the capital system that they just completely gloss over, as Matt was mentioning earlier, because Lassalle was trying to build this very strange relationship between the working class and the in society.
Yeah, sorry, you cut out a little bit there at the end, but I do want to go over this part where Marx comes in, because, the present-day society, the instruments of labor are the monopoly of the capitalist class, the resulting dependence. That is... It sounds good, right? Until you think, like, there are other classes besides just the capitalists. There's, like, the landowners. And Marx says a couple paragraphs later, the correction was introduced because Lassalle, for reasons now generally known, attacked only the capitalist class and not the landowners. In England, the capitalist class is usually not even the owner of the land on which the factory stands. I love the understatement here. I think Engels says that he... I believe in the preface to this, he says that he edited out some of the more caustic attacks that Marx made because Marx would have done it himself. But I love the understatement that sort of survives there for reasons now generally known, right? Like you can say that about like the Center for American Progress and like United Arab Emirates stories, right? Or Bloomberg, right? For reasons generally now known, they left the Bloomberg section out of the police brutality document. I love it. That's why it is like I think it's a mistake to tell people to start with Capital when they read Marx. Honestly, like I think there's a certain type of person whose brain loves that challenge, but I think having the context and seeing some of the personality makes you like sort of cultivates you to take on that project. And that's what I've thought of when I've read 18th Brumaire, and that's why I thought of reading this too. I don't know where you stand on that.
No, I think 100%. And actually, like just like take a sidestep too. This is why this text is really important. I think some of the more critical texts you can read of Marx are the Communist Manifesto, which is one you really just you can't skip because he lays out this incredible historical critique of Kant, and obviously lays out a lot of his theory there. But this text I think is really great because in critique, Marxism stands stronger. Like in critique, you can actually see, and we're going to start getting into that, where Marx actually talks about what a communist society would actually look like, because being able to juxtapose that with this kind of sloppy socialism really gives you a sharpened understanding of the Marxist criticism and why it's so effective. One thing too, I also wanted to mention about this text, a lot of people really do like to historicize this text, right? And we're trying to avoid that in this conversation because, one thing you have to understand about Marxism in particular is that it's not a static philosophy. It's quite dynamic. And it's constantly in motion because it's reacting and trying to understand the world as it is around you, right? So a kind of socialist understanding of society is going to be different in 2020 than it was when Marx wrote this text in, I believe, 1875. So we wanted to just try to move it away from focusing too much on like these very particular inter-party or extra-party struggles that are going on, and really focus on the criticism that the fundamental criticism that he's making of these kind of understandings, because we all fall into these. Like, I don't read Critique of the Gotha Program and read all of these, statements and immediately have a visceral reaction like, oh, these are bad. But it's once you start thinking about them in a really Marxist way, and then having Marx as a guide to go through it, you recognize, okay, these are kind of sloppy constructions that I'm also using in my own political analysis as well.
Yeah, I think that is really the super important point. It just helps your pattern recognition, because things can slip under, and it's often motivated, right? Things rarely get like this program here, things rarely get like fuzzed up and obscured and watered down in a way that's helpful. Right? It always seems to be rebound to some interest, but as long as you understand the patterns of how these things get sort of fuzzed up, we're dealing with this all the time, right? Access to healthcare. We all know these sorts of games. Yeah, like I think this is so much of dealing with like how these politics get co-opted by, I guess, the landowner aligned social movement.
And, it's also worth noting that, what happens to all of these socialist parties in Europe? I mean, they end up, one failing at their goal of, building socialism, and functionally, a lot of them end up just becoming, organs of the state and organs of capitalism as well. And these things have their root here. These things have their root in these kind of sloppy understandings that actually, not only are they just bad analysis, they functionally suppress, liberation or working class movements, because they don't recognize the society that they're in. And this next section actually really, I think, hits at it well, and it's probably one of the most important criticisms that Marx makes in this text.
Is this the equal rights section we're getting to now?
Yeah, the proceeds of labor. The
Okay,
the emancipation of labor demands the promotion of the instruments of labor to the common property of society and the cooperative regulation of the total labor with the fair distribution of the proceeds of labor. So this is honestly, this is, Lassalle and the Gotha program coming out with what they imagine an emancipation of labor to be. And functionally, what that is one, Marx jokes that the promotion of the instruments of labor, using the word promotion, shows that they're not really thinking about this as like a kind of, from like a historical dialectic perspective, right? The promotion, he says, is the wrong way to think about it. It's something that grows out of it. But anyways, that's, the bigger argument here that he makes is, what are the proceeds of labor? Is it the product itself, or its value, or the value added? Right? Those are very different things, and we come nowhere close to an understanding of what that does. And then there's this other very loose conception from Lassalle called, fair distribution. Again, does not the bourgeoisie believe that the current conditions are fair? Is it not that I'll just read this from Marx. Do not the bourgeoisie assert that the present day distribution is fair? And is it not, in fact, the only fair distribution on the basis of the present day mode of production? Are economic relations regulated by legal concepts, or do not, on the contrary, legal relations arise out of economic ones? Have not also the social sectarians the most varied notions about fair distribution? And I think that last bit is a really important point as well. He's making this, criticism here, saying that this kind of conception of capitalism and what we're trying to do on the other side of it is so fuzzy that, again, you could be a defender of this system and use this logic to argue that actually, the free, this is what like free market economists argue, is that the distribution that people get is the wage is set by the market, which is, something that is not controlled in its, pure sense in their conception, by human beings. Rather, it's just this completely rational system that, creates order out of chaos, right? They argue that the distribution in society is fair already, right? This is something that is like, so making this point, calling for fair distribution, you're talking about morality at the end of the day. And I want to bring this text up because it is something that people need to recognize. They get worried when they hear terms like scientific socialism. And again, I'll say this, I said this on the stream on Thursday. What scientific socialism means, it's not some kind of dogmatic politics. Rather, it's looking at society from a scientific lens that allows you to understand the different relations and the different systems that are present in society, so that you can then change it. When you do what Lassalle is doing and what the Gotha program does, is they take a scientific theory of society and capitalism and they turn it into a moral critique, right? That the distribution isn't fair. Well, no shit, it's not fair, right? But when you enter into a conversation like that and you're just basically arguing different people's moralities, you're never going to be able to get out of that swamp. And that's fundamentally, what I think Marx was so frustrated with this text. One, that it was sloppy, and two, I'm sure that that they didn't consult him to write it. But also that, you end up taking a scientific theory of society and turning it into a kind of fuzzy moral one, where you're arguing about the fair distribution of the proceeds of labor, right? Which again, socialists have very different understandings of what that means. You take something that is, that is quite firm in its understanding of society, and you make it incredibly fuzzy.
Yeah, I think Marx had an opportunity to roll in his grave in November when Illinois failed to pass a graduated income tax proposal. They have a flat tax now, and they called it the Illinois Fair Tax. Mm-hmm. So rather than actually running on any kind of like redistribution class antagonistic, type of framing, which would have been much better from my perspective, they did this fair tax, and no one like that. Yeah, like that's fuzzy to people. People didn't understand what they were voting on. Soak the rich tax. There's a tax that might get some support from people, and I guess clarify their situation a little bit too.
No, exactly. I think that's 100% right. And there's down about the reason that the right wing spends so much money on their messaging. Because you can obscure things, and you can speak to people's moral understanding, like, oh, the system isn't fair, so we need to have a fair tax system. And again, if you don't have a kind of strong understanding of what's going on, or honestly the time to be to be able to go through all these proposals, I mean, it's the same thing with Prop 22, right? In California, where you have these people saying we need to modernize the economy. We live in a different society. Like, those are unobjectable. Like you listen to that. It's like, yeah, of course, we're living in a very different society than we were 100 years ago. But essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to take people's understandings of the world and use them to basically create a horrible reactionary, future for us, where all of our worker protections are torn away. I mean, this is essentially what the Gotha program was doing to socialism. Was taking something that was trying to help people understand the world around them, and again, just ripping it to shreds and replacing it with this very fuzzy kind of moral discourse. And this next section, I think, is this next bit of his criticism of this line, I think, is really good, and particularly on the question of equality, right? Because there's another thing that people, I mean, this is like what you learn in high school, is that, what is communism? Everybody's equal, right? And that's not at all what Marx ever argued. Like, you can want that as a goal personally, I guess, but like, that's not what Marxism is ever saying. So Marx criticizes, this understanding that we get in the Gotha program, going to basically get, the fair distribution of the proceeds of labor. And he puts it in the context of what they've been saying earlier in the text. Marx says, are these socialists prepared to talk about questions as to what to do with those who cannot work or cannot work as much as others? What is the concept of equal right of all members in society when we all engage in society in frankly unequal ways? So what you end up getting from Lassalle here is that he thinks that the problem with capitalism is just an unfair distribution of the proceeds of production. And, you have to understand, think about this, like an economist, production and consumption are parts of the capital system. Simply that's what an economy is, right? You produce and then you consume. How do you produce and who gets to consume? Those are the fundamental questions of political economy, right? And what you get from Lassalle's understanding is a fixation only on the distribution of the proceeds, fixation on the distribution of, the ability to consume. And that's a huge error if you're trying to build a socialist society, because you leave out the most fundamental societal relation, which is the fact that working people are basically, compelled to have to sell their labor because they don't have access to, because capitalism destroys their ability to survive without selling their labor and receiving a wage so that they can, buy food and house themselves and all of that. Lassalle is only focusing on the other side of production and not trying to fundamentally change the way that we produce in general, right? And this is very much something that comes out of the idealism of the Lassalle argument, because communism is not something. Communism is not just a principle. It's an argument that within the society, there's certain forces that can fundamentally change the way that we live in society, right? The fact that the working class is the producer in society gives them this revolutionary potential to actually fundamentally change the way that society is run. And, but that's something that will come out of capitalism, right? And to build that kind of politics, you need to have a material understanding of how capitalism functions. And what you get with Lassalle is a fixation only on the distribution side and not at all on the production side.
Yeah, let's. Do we want to bring up this Zizek Peterson section where Zizek talks about this equal right part here?
Yeah, no, I think that's good, and we'll get to this after this bit here. But another big criticism that Marx is making is this argument about equality that we're starting to get from Lassalle, which is not a Marxist argument. In fact, it's one that he is very much against. And I think if we pull up this Zizek response to Jordan Peterson, who again has honestly like a Lassallean understanding of what socialism is. Honestly, that's probably too generous, but
Here is this is from hour 39 into this 2 hour and 45-minute debate, and I mean one of the great debates, and this is one of the great moments from it here, where Zizek basically does the you don't know nothing of Marx's work.
Centralized power. So I'm not just defending Marx. I'm saying it was not clear to him, and. So let's drop that. Maybe I have more interesting things to say. Another point. Nonetheless, where at one point I'm ready to claim, where did you find this? This goes maybe for today's politically correct jerks and so on, that this egalitarianism. There is one passage in his late critique of Gotha program where Marx directly accesses the problem of equality. And he dismisses it as a strict bourgeois category. Explicitly. For him, communism is not egalitarianism. It's, yes, hierarchies, but not based on capitalism. Okay, I'm not totally defending here Marx. I'm just saying...
you don't understand him.
Don't refer this to Marx. Okay, but to conclude, because, yes, I want to keep my promise.
And I don't think Peterson ever really addresses that.
No, he definitely, I mean, Zizek ran circles around him.
But Zizek is just amazing in that I'm not defending Marx here. Like, using those words to what he means is, I'm telling you, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about when it comes to Marx. Like, just strictly on a understanding terms, we're not agreeing before we can disagree on, actual Marx's beliefs. But yeah, so equal rights.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this is exactly, Zizek does a great job of describing that. But what Marx is, saying in the Gotha program is that, no, in society, like as just a fact, we are unequal in the sense that we're just not the same. You have some people who have extraordinary physical talents. Some people have extraordinary mental talents. Some people aren't going to be able to work as much as others. Some people just aren't going to be as productive as others.
This gets to the scientific bit, right? Where if you have to quantify labor, it's what are you going to do it by? The amount of work done or the amount of time spent doing work? Like, you can't impose equality onto those sorts of measurements across the different variables, right? They're going to be people that are differently capable for the time being. So, yeah.
And what you end up getting in this is like, what kind of system are you going to get? You're going to get a system where, you get like an hour's work certificate, and that entitles you to get a certain amount of the proceeds, of society, right? I mean, is this very fundamentally different from capitalism, right? Essentially, what you're getting from that kind of system is not this kind of emancipation of the working class, but just a slightly more equal measure of how much you can take out of society versus what you put into it, right? That's essentially what you're getting from Lassalle, and essentially this is where Marx calls this kind of a very bourgeois, egalitarianism, a very bourgeois understanding of right and equality, because it is a limited freedom. Because since we aren't going into society as, physical and mental equals in all of these different ways, you are going to have people who then will be, able to amass personal wealth at a higher rate than other people. All you're doing essentially is just resetting, the system a little bit, right? You're not fundamentally changing it. Again, this is why, this criticism that Marx makes is really important, because he's trying to prevent us from going into this kind of unfortunate system where we just reproduce capitalism again, but create a different kind of distribution model. And unless you had anything there, let's juxtapose that with what Marx calls the higher phase of communist society. Because I think this is what this text is. There's a lot in this text that's really rich, but this is one of the most important arguments that Marx makes. And I'll just read directly from the Gotha program. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also in the all-around development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So that is, if you want communism in a line, that is what it is, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, right? You are destroying the system of capitalism that obscures those two relationships, right? Because in our society now, we don't receive according to our needs, right? Some people receive massive amounts of wealth. Some people enjoy massive amounts of wealth, which is not at all reflective of their personal needs. You don't really have to go too far in that critique to understand it. And then the second argument, that when you live in a society, in a kind of communist society, and again, this is an argument that Marx is saying is not something that you can just flip, right? This is not a kind of idealist thing that you can just walk in, we take over the government, tomorrow we're going to live under this system. Rather, it's something that we will, evolve to out of the system that we're living in. But this is the fundamental goal, is that we live in a society where we all, contribute what we can, right, to society through labor. And then we have all of our needs met. And it's the destruction of the rat race. It's the destruction of the forced starvation, all of the flaws of capitalism that make life, frankly, miserable for most of us. We erase that kind of system and replace it with something that meets our needs, and also gives us a kind of responsibility to also, meet society's needs as well, because you're thinking of yourself as a member of a society rather than just kind of an individual. Anyway, so that's a really critical point. And the last bit of this first section, Marx also criticized is a good burn, I think. So this is the line: the emancipation of labor must be the work of the working class, relative to which all other classes are only one reactionary mass. And Marx responds to this: let him understand who can. Yeah. Which is such a great line.
Yeah, we should go over like the edit that was changed. So from the rules of the International, the original was: the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the workers themselves. And then it was improved. Here, on the contrary, the working class has to emancipate what? Labor? Like, let him understand who can. Yeah, that's like, you can imagine Marx doing that in a quote tweet.
I think you would have been good at that. No, but this is a fundamental point too. And this is actually why I thought about this text, because we were talking on Thursday about that moron Noah Bertowski and his labels of class reductionist, calling Marx a class reductionist. Well, you actually see the exact opposite here from Marx. If people would imagine, people imagine Marx is just writing the working class is the best and they're going to change everything, and they're only people who matter, right? He literally never says anything like that, and in fact is insulting somebody for that kind of literally, again, class reductionist. The way that our opponents put socialists out there don't really exist, but this is a kind of class reductionist argument that you're getting from Lassalle, is that everyone else other than the proletariat is a reactionary mass. And Marx again says this is absurd. It doesn't even line up with what we wrote in the manifesto. This is from the Communist Manifesto. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. So again, Marx isn't saying here that the proletariat, fuck everybody else, right? He's saying that what capitalism does is it actually reduces all other classes, all other ways of being in society, reduces us into these two major classes that are constantly, that are in conflict and are developing, that all these other classes are developing into one of those two classes. We should maybe one day spend some time with the analytical Marxists, because they spend a lot of time trying to negotiate this, because it is difficult, because we all do live, in a society where we are interacting with the world around us in very different ways. Depending on class and culture and race and all of these other factors. Again, Marx doesn't reject this. What he is arguing here is that the way that history is moving is to reduce all other ways of being into being, proletarian. Mm-hmm. Honestly, even look at the PMC, and let's specifically look at academia. What's going on in the United States right now when it comes to academia is you're seeing this class that is, historically privileged class, even, before capitalism, of, the scholar, who has always been able to a liberal society. The idea is that they're able to stand outside of society in a way, even in their relationship to production. What have you seen in the past 40 years with the university system in this country? These professors and scholars are becoming proletarian proletarianized in mass. Not everybody, but think about,
Adjuncts.
Adjunct professors, exactly, grad student workers. All of these people are finding themselves more and more close to the proletarian than to this kind of, intelligentsia class that had existed before. That's the point that Marx is making, is that all these other distinctions, the way that history is moving is, as he said, the Communist Manifesto, the other classes decay and finally disappear. That's what you're starting to see. It's not that there aren't extremely privileged members of the intelligentsia, the academia and all that, I think it'd be a little bit difficult to call them properly proletarian, right? But rather that even within this class, they are being pulled into, the ranks of the proletariat. And that, anyways, that's the kind of fundamental, point that Marx makes. And again, it's the same thing with the peasantries, that the peasantry, in Marxism, they argue, is too becoming proletarianized, right? Because the older system of, your farming, your farming, small farmers, essentially, you own, I guess, your land and your production in some level, but you're not fully engrossed into like the capitalist production system as what we see today with modern agriculture, where the farm workers are completely proletarianized as well, right? All of these classes, are shifting in clearly in one direction. And that's the real kind of class argument that Marx is making here. And he also, just to wrap up this section too, he also makes this point about the bourgeoisie. Again, sometimes people are very surprised to hear how Marx write about the bourgeoisie, because he does also call them a revolutionary class, because they revolutionized society out of feudalism, out of the forms of production. And this is a really great point that Marx makes too. The proletariat is revolutionary relative to the bourgeoisie because, having itself grown up on the basis of large-scale industry, it strives to strip off from production the capitalist character that the bourgeoisie seeks to perpetuate. And I really love this line, and it reminds me, not to be all hoity-toity or anything like that, but it reminds me of one of my favorite lines of Derrida. Derrida wrote this book called Spectres of Marx, which honestly, as political analysis, is extremely fussy. But he does have this really poetic line that I do like about Marxism, where he calls it the only suicidal philosophy. And what does he mean by that? It's the only philosophy that actually wants to undo the system that it analyzes. Like Marxism, like once we move into communism, like Marxism will, frankly, in a lot of ways, won't be as useful as it is today, right? Because it's the only society that philosophy that fundamentally wants to eradicate what makes itself possible. And that's the same thing with the proletariat too. A lot of people think that what communists want to do is to turn everyone into proletariat. It's the opposite. Rather, by the proletariat as a class too is suicidal in the sense that it wants to destroy the conditions that make it a proletariat, and actually from that we will see the abolition of class as a concept at all in society, right? And it's a really cool and poetic way to think about it. But it's really critical to think about class in that way, is that like what we are trying to do is we're seeing everyone be proletarianized. And as socialists, what we're trying to do is actually destroy the conditions that turn any of us into any member of a class. And that's the real radical potential of the proletariat compared to the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie was radical because it wanted to, erase the kind of, the former systems of class, which a lot of them were related to production. But, if you think about like untouchables or things like that, a lot of them were, related to, superstition and religion of that nature. The bourgeoisie fundamentally changed that class dynamic by destroying, the monarchy and those kind of systems. So it was radical in that sense, but it's not radical in the sense that it won't go the next step. And that's where the radical potential of the proletariat is. We can move on to these last couple of bits. I might need your help here because I'm moving off of my notes to make sure I'm not skipping any sections, but we have here the free state bit, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and the iron will of
the iron law of wages.
Yeah, which sets up some more funny Marx at the end of this. But yeah, do you just want to introduce the iron law of wages?
Let's read this first section in the Gotha program that Marx is criticizing. Starting from these basic principles, the German Workers' Party, by all legal means, for the free state and social society, that the abolition of the wage system together with the iron law of wages and exploitation in every form, the elimination of all social and political inequality. So Marx, promises to return to the free state as well, very soon. But first, he takes aim at the iron law of wages, which is something that Lassalle came up with, which is his basic philosophy.
Well, I just want to go to the second paragraph here. It is well known that nothing of the iron law of wages is Lassalle's except the word iron, brought from Gotha, great eternal iron laws.
It's so good. Yeah, I mean, I can briefly explain what the philosophy is. Essentially, it's this idea that there is a ceiling of possible wages, right? And as more people, let me make sure I'm getting this right. As more people are introduced into the wage system, actually collapse. Because there is like a limited amount of money,
as more people are entered into the wage system, it will eventually collapse, you said, right?
Yeah. As more people enter into the wage system, it will eventually collapse, and you'll just see wages decline fundamentally and forever. And this, again, does not come from a criticism of capitalism, but rather a kind of an argument of limit, that there's actually, it's like only so much possible in the world. There's only just so many resources in the world that once you hit a certain limit, everyone is just going to have to see their standards of living reduced. And this is not a unique argument to wages. This is something that constantly gets popped up as a very kind of human fixation. It's the same thing with like the overpopulation fixation.
Malthus,
yeah, it's Malthus, right? We're just going to reach a moment where there's just not going to be enough, and everyone's standard of living is going to to fall. Yeah. And Marx makes arguments, that capitalism, that there is a declining rate of profit, but it's not from this, right? And this is, again, why Marx is criticizing him, because it's an absurd kind of formulation. Because it completely ignores the role that capitalism plays in distributing and producing those wages, which is why they're actually falling, and instead creates this wild notion that it's just because we're just living in a limited world. And he has a really hilarious line that I think will help me explain this better, talking about slavery.
Yeah.
So basically what Marx goes on, to argue, is one that if Lassalle is correct in this law, that this law is iron, right? That means it can never be abolished, and it will exist in each social system from here on out, including in the socialist system, right? So you can't abolish this law by Lassalle's own logic. Again, this law is wrong, but Marx is making the point that, like, even on insane world Lassalle, like your concepts don't stand up to scrutiny, and essentially they make this argument that poverty has its basis in nature, which is not true. Poverty is a result of a social system that robs the working people and impoverishes everybody, right? This is a social system, not some kind of natural law. And again, this is a really important distinction to make too, between a materialist versus like a kind of squishy understanding of politics, or an idealist understanding of politics. When you start to make the reality, like poverty, for example, if you start to make that seem natural or a moral question, because that's what it becomes. It becomes a moral question. How much poverty can we accept in society? Rather than a kind of scientific understanding, like, actually, no, poverty is the result of the social system that we're living under, and that is a system that we can change. That is why Marx is so against this kind of understanding. One, because in addition to the fact that it's extremely unscientific. So to hit on this further, Marx makes a very hilarious argument about using this kind of formulation with slavery, right? So this is from the text. It is as if among slaves who have at last got behind the secret of slavery and broken out in rebellion, a slave still enthralled to obsolete notions were to inscribe on the program of the rebellion, slavery must be abolished because the feeding of the slaves in the system of slavery cannot exceed a certain low maximum. Right? Again, so like that would be an absurd reason to, oppose slavery. The reasons you oppose slavery are quite obvious. And that's what Marx's point here is, that like this kind of bizarre conception that Lassalle is putting forward, the iron law of wages, is fixating on the wrong thing and will actually look incredibly hilarious on the other side of the critique. Or if we enter into a new system, that some guy was arguing that the problem with capitalism was that you can only have so many at a certain wage. So I don't have Marx's ability to really make kind of technical arguments like that, slap as well as he can, but these ones will be a little bit quicker because they're just not as juicy as part one. Part one, for people who want to spend some time reading this, I think is really one of the the wealthier parts of the text. But part three says the German Workers' Party, in order to pave way to the solution of the social question, demands the establishment of producers' cooperatives societies with state aid under the democratic control of the toiling people. The producers' cooperation societies are to be called into being for industry and agriculture on such a scale that the socialist organization of the total labor will arise from them. So, he makes this good point too. Is like, what kind of a conception of the state is this? So in this argument here, the working people actually do not seize control of the state, but rather are relying on state aid. That basically they just get to be in control of, where the state is, basically giving people, grants to build a bunch of co-ops. And again, he makes an interesting criticism of the co-op form too, that, maybe we could do a little bit of a return to this down the line. Don't get it wrong. Marx is not against cooperative or the cooperative model. But he's saying this is an extremely limited view of socialism, because essentially what you're doing is it is important, and this is from Marx, co-ops are of value insofar as they are independent creations of the workers and not proteges either the governments or the bourgeois, right? So he says, like, these are really important developments. So he's not against cooperatives, but he is saying, like, if this is your end goal, right, you can barely call yourself a socialist because you are not fundamentally changing the relation in society. You're just sort of redistributing, a bit of control, right? And this is not the kind of radical break. Again, what we talked about earlier when Marx said the communist society will inscribe on its banners from each according to his ability to each according to their need, right? This is not building that kind of system. This is actually very much staying within a capitalist mode of production, which is a reshuffling. It would be a reshuffling that would be immensely more equitable. Don't get us wrong, but it's not this kind. They're supposed to be communists. They're supposed to be changing this whole society, and it's a kind of, it would be a strange destination for the radical parties that are literally being outlawed and oppressed in all of these countries. That all they want to do is just build a couple more cooperatives in Germany.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like unless you have more to say, I feel like the next part is probably still second juiciest compared to the first, right?
Yeah, I think so.
This is where he gets back to the free state. Let's say you had more to say on the...
No, I think that's perfect. Do you want to set that up?
Yeah, so Marx himself says, I now come to the democratic section, and the party's quoting is the free basis of the state.
Well, he makes the funny argument is like, what do you mean by free state? What is this? Do you mean setting the state free?
Right. Yeah. It's like, because that sense of freedom, right? Historically, freedom, America's sense, this is terribly apparent. Edmund Morgan has a book on colonial Virginia called American Freedom, American Slavery, about how those two concepts, freedom and slavery, arise dependent on each other. And then it's not only an American thing. That happened in Roman times too, that people start talking about freedom when they have the ability to command people to do all the work for them. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that's what does free state mean? What would a free Bismarckian Germany do? Or I guess it would be Bismarckian at that point, but what they're saying.
And it's also a kind of bizarre way of thinking about the state. And this is something I will say, I think we actually will have to come back to, because state theory in Marxism is actually very contentious. So this is what Marx's argument about it, but people like Poulantzas and Ralph Miliband have developed a very different understanding of the state, particularly from Lenin's understanding. But Lenin got a lot of his understanding of the state from Marx. And he makes the argument here that freedom consists in converting the state from an organ superimposed upon society into one completely subordinate to it. So, how does he mean that? Like, functionally, what he's arguing here, or a kind of Marxist understanding of the state, is that the state like sits on top of society and it allows capitalism to function, right, through the legal system and all these kind of arguments. What the state will do under a communist system, this is where Marx has his very famous line about the state withering away, is that instead of the state actually sitting on top of society and dictating to everybody what to do, the state, and this is the line from Marx when he says, the state will go from the managing of people into the managing of things, right? And what does he mean by that? I mean, functionally, what the state will do, it will be the kind of organizational structure that we need to, distribute goods and to implement from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, right? And then that system becomes fundamentally different from the kind of state system that we have today, or even some kind of formulations of like state socialism, because you won't need the state to basically come in and, infringe on people's, rights or freedoms, because society will be functioning in a way that a lot of the ills that, the state comes in to fix won't be there anymore, right? And not having that kind of conception of what a state can be, again, you're just bringing capitalism, the former system, capitalism, into the future. You're bringing it into, the supposed socialist move, which is supposed to be this kind of, radical break with that.
Yeah, I mean, is it too early to get to the income tax bit here specifically?
No, I think that's perfect.
Yeah, and I think this is very interesting in the way it makes the state dependent on those classes continuing to exist, and not just like as a means to try to attack the wealth and expropriate the wealth of those classes, right? Like it'd be one thing if taxes were completely to try to like stop certain activities from even be like profitable in society, but really they're setting their agreements with partners.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. And again, too, like, needing income tax or tax in general for the state to function means relying on the kind of capitalist system as well, right? You tax out of the productive, system. And so you're reliant on, capitalist production continuing in the same way. And there's an interesting argument here too, actually, unless you had anything else on this section about about education, which I think is really phenomenal here, because public schools are definitely are a socialist creation. They come out of the working class movement. The demand is incredibly important to building a new future, right? This is something, especially in the 1800s, though, was quite radical still. But Marx has a quibble with this demand here, and it's really important, actually, especially knowing what happened with societies like the Soviet Union or even China. So this is from the Gotha program. The German Workers' Party demands as an ethical basis of the state, universal and equal elementary education by the state, universal compulsory school tenets, free instruction. And he makes the first argument that this is not looking at a new kind of society. These things exist in the United States, and they exist in Switzerland. So you're not really anyway. Like you're not society is sort of moving in a way, in a direction anyway. So this demand is sort of not as critical, but he really is frustrated with the idea of state education, which I think is incredibly interesting. He's not against, obviously, free schooling, but he doesn't like the idea of the state sending in operatives into communities to educate people. He would rather having the communities educate themselves and have that be funded by society at large, right? And that's a really interesting debate in education that I'm not too well versed in, but between kind of like hardcore, national standards versus, community education, which is interesting too. And also, we all want to avoid a kind of, society where, the state is dictating to us, what is, education standards. And also, exactly, like the history that we can learn and all of that kind of stuff, right? Marx is like seeing that why this could be really dangerous to develop. particularly because he's living in Germany, a incredibly, oppressive regime at that point. He doesn't want the German government to be the ones coming into society and telling everybody, okay, these are the books you have to read, or this is what you need to know.
And I mean, this is why I have trouble with people who identify as Marxists that just say the obvious solution to our sort of technological communication platform monopoly problem is just to seize it all by the state. And it's like, yeah. I don't think the U.S. government or the DOJ or whoever is going to be put in charge of that is really who you want, making these decisions.
No, I think you're 100% right. And
ultimately, if we had if we had transitioned to a communist society, or even we were on the transition phase, maybe we would have a better system to administer this stuff. But we're not even close.
No, exactly. But also, it's the way that people will consider, what the state is. Like, you need to have a Marxist understanding of what the state is really to get this point. And what do I mean? Understand that the state in this system that we live in, the United States, is a system that is completely dominated by the class interests of the bourgeoisie, right? And there are people who think that emboldening the state in general will lead to, liberation only if we are in control of that system, only we, meaning, the working class, so, and then under like a working class system, you won't need the state to function in the same way, because all of the functions that the state currently plays in our society will be played, socially, instead of relying on kind of state apparatus. And this is a fundamental Marxist position. Like, this is fundamental to Marxism. And it's very funny to see people missed that Marx was very, very critical of relying too much on the state to be able to create the new kind of society. Because again, this is an organ of oppression. This is an organ that was designed to, basically reproduce a system of capitalism and hold people in line if they are to deviate from it, right? That's what the state functionally does. And, again, like, Marx is very critical of that and is very worried about these kind of ideas that, we're going to be able to, wield the state ourselves, right?
What's your pitch on the dictatorship of the proletariat?
I mean, we live under people misunderstand that quote a lot. Particularly, I think it's better to understand that quote in opposition to what we're living under now, which is the chip of the bourgeoisie. And that's the kind of fundamental Marxist point, is that we live in a society, again, the state is dominated by bourgeois interests, right? That's what it functionally does, is it operates as the organ of bourgeois power. They have power in the workplace, and then they also rely on the state to protect them and to maintain their power. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the opposite relation. Where no longer do you have this powerful organ that belongs to the bourgeoisie, but rather this is in the hands of the working class, and that means working to eradicate the privileges and benefits that the bourgeoisie have, with the goal not of subverting everybody into like a miserly life, but rather to abolish class as a useful category in general. Like, that's what fundamentally the dictatorship of the proletariat means.
Yeah, I mean, Marx mentions the Paris Commune. I think later when you hear I'm most familiar with Orwell talking about the moments in the Spanish Revolution. That's where a class of society had emerged for a brief moment in time, and then ultimately crushed. I want to quote from Peter Linebaugh in Counterpunch. His afterword to Karl Marx's critique of the Gotha program. He says, "We are familiar with the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The democratic levelers of the 1640s were followed by the dictator Cromwell. The insurgent Jacobins of the 1790s were followed by the Emperor Napoleon. The Russian Bolsheviks of the 1920s were followed by Stalin. Marx had learned from the Paris Commune that the proletariat cannot simply take over the state and use it for its own purposes. It must smash the state." And then there's just another historical note I found interesting. W.B. Du Bois intended to call his chapter on black Reconstruction in South Carolina the dictatorship of the black proletariat in South Carolina, but changed it to simply the black proletariat in South Carolina. He made this change after it was brought to his attention that since universal suffrage does not lead to a real dictatorship until workers use their votes consciously to rid themselves of the dominion of private capital. There are signs of such an object among South Carolina Negroes, but it was always coupled with the idea of that day that the only real escape for a laborer was himself to own capital.
I think that puts it extremely well. Yeah, I think, and especially the kind of consciousness aspect of it too. And this is kind of fundamental actually to like the Marxist understanding. It's like you have to have this kind of consciousness because you can get to a position where your power is increasing, but without that kind of general consciousness, we're not going to know what to do with it, and we'll revert, to the present way of doing things.
Yeah.
I think, that's the text, y'all. I think, just really briefly, I'll just sum up. Like, I think this text is really great because it challenges you as a reader to sort of go through some of the sloppy notions that you have. I think it does a really interesting job at making the point that like socialism is not just about making so don't get me wrong, like we want everyone to have higher wages, right? But socialism is not just about if we got everybody if we got minimum wage to $25 an hour, we won't be satisfied because we actually fundamentally want to change this entire system of production. I think it does a really great job at articulating that kind of understanding of what socialism means. And then obviously it's a really eloquent way of describing what a communist society could be like when he says from each according to their need to each according to their ability. I love the criticism of the state at the end. I think we actually should maybe sometime get some people who are really well versed in state theory to sort of go through that, because that is a philosophy that does develop and actually goes in a different way within Marxism after Marx passes. So those debates are actually very interesting. But yeah, this is a really rich text. It's hilarious.
It is super funny.
I know you probably don't expect to read a text like this and to laugh, but you really will.
I mean, if you've enjoyed laughing at Duncan on liberals, I mean, that's kind of what Marx is doing a little bit here. I wanted to put this to you, maybe as a follow-up to this, the program of the Workers' Party with the preamble and the political and economic sections there. It seems to me like these are sort of like the two I don't know how to say it, rails of Marx, like what he's comfortable with being done in his name. And I don't know, are you terribly familiar with the program of the Workers' Party? This is the one where, eventually, after falling out with Jules Gesde, he said, if this is Marxism, I'm not a Marxist, or something like that.
Yeah. I know that's an interesting one because if I remember correctly, they completely refused the minimum program, right? For the maximum program.
Right. And the only reason I'm a little bit confused is because that you're right. That's how it's phrased. But in my brain, I can't figure out what is meant by the minimum and maximum program. Is the maximum the original section here? I'll just share it with you.
Yeah. I'm pulling it up right now. I mean, it's a really short one.
Yeah.
Again,
is the preamble and political section the maximum section, or because there's 3 sections here and neither of them are labeled maximum or minimum? Yeah,
so in the economic section, they have these basic kind of reforms that they can make, right? Legal minimum wage, protective supervision. I don't know what that is.
Like stuff we've heard of, basically.
Yeah, like essentially like workers' movement demands, right? Responsibility of society for the old and the disabled, Social Security. Like you read these actually, and you're like, wow, this is essentially what becomes, social democracy. Program. Marx wrote this, and they put at the beginning the political section, those are the radical demands. That's the abolition of all laws over the press, removal of the suppression of the public debt, abolition of standing armies and the general arming of the people, the commune to be the master of its administration and its police. Right?
Yeah, especially 4 and 5 are the 2 that you're going to need probably a revolution to do.
So what this like debate is about essentially is that Marx is saying like we have a perfectly good list of demands of things that we say, because what this is the program of the party. It's like this is what we want to do when we come into power, right? And the economic section is a way to say to people like, look, we can fundamentally change our relationship. We can change the conditions of our work and make it better. These are some really easy things that we can do to alleviate the suffering that people are feeling right now. And also to, test their strength and gain power, and and to get a foothold in the society, to make the working class stronger, right? And what you end up having is this kind of like over fixation that like these are reforms, and we need to do the most radical program possible, and that's when Marx.
Yeah, apparently Guzdas, or I don't know how to pronounce that name, but they basically thought that all the demands were implausible under even reformism, and as we know, a lot of this stuff wasn't implausible. And Marx is like, well, how would you characterize Marx's response? I was looking for that letter. Maybe when we do this episode, we'll go deeper into.
Yeah, I don't have the letter in front of me, but essentially he calls them. I mean, it's a really fiery letter from Marx. He calls them all stupid, essentially. Yeah. It says like these are things, as I was saying earlier, that will have direct benefit in people's life, and you have to give people victories, right? We have to develop to a stage where we can
that's useful, actually. Like not the material benefit is great, and actually people shouldn't discount that at all. And also doing good for people in that way is useful for a political project.
Exactly. And he argues that like people just won't be sated. If you give them these reforms, they're going to demand more. And then Marx has this really famous line, which is oftentimes like quoted by right wingers who don't understand what it's in reference to, but Marx has this famous line where he says, if this is Marxism, then I'm not a Marxist, which is, it'd be awesome to be able to use your name like that in a verb.
Exactly. That's the ultimate like flex.